Welcome to my studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to tackle one of the most challenging tasks artists have to deal with, capturing likeness. I'm going to take you through my process of doing it, one that I have refined over my 35 years of drawing and 20 years of teaching. In order to do this subject justice, this will be a long-form video done entirely in real time, similar to the videos available to my channel members who, with a small monthly fee, get access to a large library of long-form tutorials and 2 new classes every single month. So, if you like this video, please consider becoming a member of my channel. Okay, let's get started. Before starting the demonstration, let's quickly go over what materials I'm going to be using to make the drawing. For my pencil, I'm going to be using Wolf's Carbon, which comes in a variety of hardnesses, 2B, 4B, and 6B. So I'm going to start the drawing with the harder 2B pencil and then work my way up towards the softer 4B and 6B varieties. I'm going to be using 2 tools to blend the drawing to create softer transitions, a blending stump and a nice soft paper towel. And then for my erasing, I have 2 different kinds of erasers, a kneaded eraser and a little eraser holder for getting sharp details. Okay, so those are the materials. Now we can start the demonstration. Before discussing the specifics of how to get a likeness, we need to understand something called average proportions. So let's go through those average proportions. I'm going to start the drawing with an oval. The shape of the oval doesn't have to be super precise, but you're thinking something like an egg, with the proportions being one width about 3/4 of the height. And then I'm going to determine the rotation of the head based on something called a center line. Center line is an imaginary line that runs through the middle of the features. So when the head is looking straight at you, the center line aims straight. If the head is in profile, meaning that it's looking directly to the side, the center line runs along the side here. And in this case, because our model is in 3/4 view, our center line is going to follow this path. Now this is something really important. It's going to curve in the upper half, and in the lower half of the drawing, it's going to hang straight. So curving in the upper half, lower half hangs straight. That's step 1. You're going to determine the rotation of your head based on the center line. The next step is to determine eye level, where the middle of the eyes are relative to this oval. The average is right through the middle, meaning that the distance from the chin to the middle of the eye on most people is the same as from the middle of the eye to the top of the head. Place it exactly in the middle, like so. I'm going to start my drawing at the intersection between my center line and my eye level. This is something I like to call the anchor point. This is what's going to anchor the drawing. This is where I'm going to start the drawing and start fanning out. So let's look at where that intersection actually is on the face. It's going to be the bridge of the nose. So from the bridge of the nose, I'm going to make 2 little indentations, 2 little indications. This represents the side of the nose at the bridge. And then I'm going to start working my way up and determining the angles of the brows. So they're going to look like this and like this. There are 2 angles there we're looking for. We're looking for the angle of the brow at the forehead. So we have a forehead plane like this. And then at some point, and it's going to vary from person to person, that angle is going to shift downward where the forehead starts transitioning into the temple. So we have 2 angles here, one going this way, one going this way, and then 2 angles going down. Now you want to make sure that the angles go down back to our eye level, like so. Boom and boom. Now we know where our brow line is. So we're going to draw a little line from one top of the brow to the other. That's our brow line. Now we can start working our way down and figuring out the proportions of the face. Now, on average, if I take the distance from the brow line to the chin and I find the middle, let's see if that's the middle, that's going to give me a very good indication of where the base of the nose is going to be, where the nostrils line up, where the starting point of the nose is. And then, if I take a measurement of the distance from the base of the nose to the chin, find the middle, that's going to give me a pretty decent indication of where the mouth line is going to be. Now I'm going to start sketching my way down the center line and getting the shape of the nose, which is a wedge shape, like so. Then I can find the mouth and the chin. Now that I worked my way down, now I can start placing the eyes. Why do I wait to place the eyes? Why don't I put them in right away? Because placing the eyes in the right spot is the most delicate operation in your drawing. It has to be done exactly right. It's an area that gets intense scrutiny. And if we make a little mistake in the position, it's also going to change the likeness quite a bit. So on average, where the nostril ends, the ending points on the nostril here and here, is where the inside of the eye begins. So here's the inside of the eye on one side, and then on the other side, you can see the starting point here. So there's a nostril here, there's a little nostril coming out on the opposite side here. Those are the starting points of the eyes on the inside. Where do they end on the outside? There's a fairly easy way to work that out. If I take the distance from one eye to the other, that's going to give me the width of the eyes on both sides. Now obviously we have issues of perspective. Our face is receding back in space. This eye is going to appear a little bit smaller than this one, but we're talking about averages here. And obviously it's going to vary quite a lot. Some people's eyes are more widely placed, some people's eyes are more narrowly placed, some people's eyes are deeper. There's lots and lots of variation. Right now we're just focused on averages, on kind of generic proportions. So once we place the eyes, now we can start sketching them in. What I like to do is first indicate the shape of the eye by drawing little spheres like this. And then I can use those spheres to guide me along to draw the shapes. It helps center the eyes on the right place. I can see where they're running through the sphere. And then, this is really important, I usually draw the eyes at the same time. So I work on one side, and then I compare one side to the opposite side. So I'm constantly bouncing back and forth and comparing the eyes against each other. So this eye is looking this way, whereas the other eye looking the same direction. Work back and forth to get the proper alignment. Once I have the facial features, now I can start carving or adding to the face and getting the shape. So notice that I'm working from the facial features out, as opposed to working on the outside and then getting the facial features. Right? This is, I think, a really important aspect in getting the likeness. It's very difficult to get the contours of the face first without knowing the inside structures. So by working your way out, you can start comparing the inside with the outside, so where things line up against the facial features. That is going to give you a more accurate head shape. Now that I have the head shape, now I can finally start placing my ears. So here's one ear, here, let's say, is the other ear. I can start drawing the hair, like so, for example. And now that everything's kind of sketched in, now I can start working into the details and getting details of the facial features. Now, these features represent, it's not really average, but it's something that's very easy to remember. I don't know what the average is, right? I don't think, perhaps maybe in the 19th century, phrenologists studied these things and worked out what is the average proportion of the placement of the eye. The reason why it's important to memorize these proportions is because to get a likeness, we need to compare what we're seeing against the proportions that we have here. So our average proportion has the eye exactly in the middle. When we're trying to capture a likeness, we're going to work out whether the eyes are a little bit higher than the middle or a little bit lower than the middle. We sketch out the brows, we find the brow line, and then when we work our way down, we work out whether the nose is a little bit higher than the middle or a little bit lower than the middle. Same thing with the mouth. When it comes to placement of the mouth, it's going to be in lots of different places. Actually, very rarely exactly in the middle. Often this space is a little bit smaller. But on some people it's lower. So we're going to determine how the proportions of the person we're seeing vary from these quote-unquote average proportions. By having these average proportions in mind, it allows us to hone in on the likeness with, I think, slightly greater accuracy, as opposed to just drawing things willy-nilly and hoping for the best. Okay, so let me show you how this process of comparing average proportions to specific proportions works in actual practice. So in this case, we have an actual person, a reference in front of us. We're going to try to keep the oval more or less the same, except now I notice that our reference is not cooperating and actually has a little bit of a tilt to him. So notice that his head is tilted ever so slightly this way. How can I tell? I can measure the angle of the center line. So this line right here, if the person's head is straight up and down, in the bottom half it's going to be perfectly straight. So we can imagine a line from the middle of the brows, through the middle of the mouth, through the chin. Right, that line is straight. If I hold my pencil against the center line on the reference and I notice, wait a second, there's a tilt, what I can do is roughly sketch in the angle of that line and then orient my oval to line up with that angle. That's going to help me determine the tilt of the head, which I think I may have exaggerated ever so slightly. Right, so I think maybe the angle's a little bit steeper like this, a little bit of a gentle tilt. Now we have the oval. Now we can determine the center line. Again, it's going to curve in the upper half. There's a little bit of rotation, actually less rotation, I think, than I had in my imaginary drawing, in my average drawing. Something that looks like this. And then, because our center line is tilted, due to the tilt of the oval, our eye level is going to be tilted as well, roughly perpendicular to the angle of eye level. So it's going to run like this. But here's an important thing to keep in mind. This line runs on average through the middle of the oval. To get a likeness, I need to place it exactly where it is on our reference. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit higher, sometimes it's going to run a little bit lower. We need to know where it is, or at least get some kind of rough estimate of its position. How do we do that? By comparing these two distances against each other and figuring out which one is longer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by using my proportion measuring tool. If you're not familiar with how to use the proportion measuring tool, I have a video for you which I'll link to in the description section. But here's how it works. I hold my pencil straight, close my opposite eye of the hand I'm holding the pencil with, and then I move my arm up so that the tip of the pencil lines up with the middle of the eye. Then I slide my thumb up and down so it lines up with the chin. And then I compare this distance against this distance. If, when I move my arm up and line my thumb up with the middle of the eye, the tip of the pencil lines up exactly with the scalp, what does that tell me? That tells me that these two distances are indeed the same. However, if when I do that, I realize that the tip of my pencil hovers above the hairline or through the hairline, that tells me that this person's eye level is set a little bit higher. So let's do that measurement on our reference. The tip of my pencil lines up with the middle of his eyes. My thumbnail slides up and down until it lines up with his chin. Now I'm going to move my entire arm up so my thumbnail is where the tip of the pencil used to be, and in this case I feel like the tip of the pencil is hovering a little tiny bit above his scalp, very, very slightly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that distance in my oval. So this is the middle right here, right about there. If I lift my fingers upward a little bit, then when I move my arm up, the second increment is going to hover just a little bit above the scalp. So I'm going to set my eye level this way. And then I'm going to give my eye level a little bit of a tilt, again, perpendicular to my center line. And these things are measurable. I can measure the angles from one eye to the other to determine the angle of the eyes. And by the way, a lot of people's eyes are not perfectly lined up. You'll find with many people, one eye is a little bit higher than the other, that faces can be asymmetrical. These are things that obviously, if you're trying to capture a likeness, you need to pay attention to. Okay, we have the center line. We have our eye level determined. Now we're going to sketch in our anchor point. This is going to vary on everybody. On some people, the bridge of the nose here is very narrow. On some people, it's wider. Right now, we're just roughly estimating the width. His nose is fairly prominent. So we're just going to put two little increments, two little notches here. Again, that's going to be our starting point. Now we're going to work up, and we're going to use very simple lines, very simple angles to indicate the tilt, the angle of the brow. So his brows are very furrowed in a very intense stare, but we have an angle going this way, and then we have another angle going this way. Then I'm looking for an angle going down. This is a part of the likeness that's very important. Some people have very prominent brows. Some people's brows are a little bit lower, a little bit higher. They're arched in constant surprise, or they're kind of hovering over the eyes in a state of constant sleepiness, anger. Right? The brows convey a lot of psychology, a lot of emotion. Pay attention to the angles here. We're always looking for two. So there's a lot going on. Again, his brows are more furrowed, the muscles are pulled over the structures here. But we're looking for basic angles. And don't forget to return the angle of the brow back to eye level. Okay, now we're going to sketch in a little line at the peaks of the brows here, like this. Sketch in a little line that represents the chin. And now we're going to work out the proportions of the nose and the line of the mouth. So we know that on average, that the distance from here to here, if divided in half, will give you the base of the nose. That's the average though. In order to figure out exactly where it is, we need to compare these two distances. We're going to do that with our proportion measuring tool. So what I'm going to do is hold my pencil here. So tip my pencil lines up with the base of the nose. My thumb slides up and down until it lines up with the chin. And then I'm going to move my arm up and see where the tip of the pencil lines up. If the tip of the pencil lines up exactly with the brow line, that tells me that these two distances are the same. If my pencil hovers above the brow line, what does that tell me? It tells me that this distance is a little bit longer, and I want to set up the exact, or close to it, proportions that I'm seeing. So let's see what we have here. Okay, on this particular model, things are very close. So from the base of the nose to the brow, almost exactly equal. On most people, it's going to be either half or a little bit higher. Lower is a little bit rare. That's going to be somebody with a very prominent nose. And that's something you're going to be able to tell right away. Right? So on this model, on this actor, these distances are roughly equidistant. Boom, boom, roughly the same. Now let's work out the proportions of the mouth. This might be a little bit more difficult to measure because if the model is at some distance away, it might be hard to work out exactly where those increments are. However, look at the distances here versus the distance here. On this model, clearly, we have more distance here than we do here. Right? Look at angles. Right? So we're looking at the angle of the mouth. It's going to be very similar to the angle of eye level. So if eye level is tipped up, the mouth is going to be tipped up a little bit. Just get the angle. Don't worry about specific details. Now, it's very difficult at this stage to determine whether you have the proportions right. However, it's so crucial that it be close. Right? So right now we can kind of see that the face is taking shape. We can't tell whether I have things right, but because I'm working so loose, I'm going to be able to make little tiny micro adjustments along the way and get the proportions right. Right? So do not obsess over this stage. If you're completely off, then your drawing is going to be a struggle. But little by little, over time, you'll find yourself getting closer and closer and closer to the actual angles and proportions that you're seeing, and you're going to get increasingly more effective, more efficient likenesses as a result. Okay, now I'm going to start working my way down, and once again, I'm looking for very simple lines. I'm looking at the width of the nose here. I'm trying not to commit because I'm not sure whether I have this right or not. So I'm just really loosely sketching in some simple lines, simple angles for the mouth. Simple lines, simple angles. And to work out where things are, I'm paying attention to alignments. So for example, for the middle of the mouth, I'm working out where the middle of the mouth lines up against the center line. On some people, it's going to line up exactly on the center line. On some people, if somebody has very prominent lips, the mouth is going to push increasingly more this way. To get that exactly right, I can hold my pencil up against the center line and see where things line up. So this particular face, the center of the mouth, and my center line are more or less on the same level. That's not always going to be the case, right? It depends. And again, at this point, I can start making little tiny adjustments. So if I feel like I need a little bit more space here, right, I can make that adjustment. Right? Okay, now we can start placing the eyes. Again, the reason why I do this last is because it's hard to do it in isolation from everything else. So now I have context. I have these frames. I know where the eye sits, roughly. Right? I know how big it needs to be because I can make relative comparisons. So we said that generally where the nostril ends, the eye begins. That's going to vary on everybody. So one thing I notice is that on this particular actor, the eyes are fairly closely spaced. And the inside of the eye lines up where? A little bit on the inside of the nostril. Right? So here's the nostril. Right? The eyes are kind of closely spaced here. And then the distance here between the bridge of the nose and the starting point of the eye, also very closely spaced, like this. Right? Okay, as far as the distances here, I'm not going to rely on the spacing here. I can measure by using angles. How am I going to use the angles to work out where the eye needs to end? I'm going to take an angle from the base of the nose at the center line to the outside corner of the eye. That's an angle measurement. Right? So line up your pencil with the angle, measure the angle, sketch it in. There's one corner. Right? And then let's measure on the other side. Here's another angle. When the face is aimed at us, the angles here are going to be the same. Right? In three-quarter view, this angle is going to be steeper. It's not going to be a direct reflection of this angle. Right? The angle on this side is going to be a little bit steeper, more compressed. Again, this is still relatively rough, but the more things we have, the more features we have, the more we can start making comparisons between them and start to hone in, triangulate, in this case, what the facial features are. The difficulty is getting started. Right? We have inadequate information. We're working against absolutely nothing. It's really difficult. This is why it's so important to stay loose at this stage. We don't have enough information to be super specific. Right? So don't dive into detail. Right? Get big proportions. We're trying to preview the drawing before we commit to absolutely anything. Okay. Now, we know that the eye starts here. it ends here, roughly. We know that the eye starts here. We know that it ends here, also roughly. On some people, the inside eye of the eye and the outside of the eye do not line up, right? They're not going to be on the same angle. On some people, the eyes are going to be a little bit higher on the outside, or they might be a little bit lower on the outside. So the angle of the eye also is a determining factor. How do we make sure we get it right? By lining your pencil up against the middle of the eye and seeing whether the outside of the eye is higher or lower. Now we have to do it at this angle. So I line up my pencil with the inside of the eye at this angle and see where the outside of the eye lines up. Okay, on this particular face, let's see. On this particular face, I think the outside and the inside of the eye more or less line up. Maybe it's a little bit lower. Okay, so let's start sketching in the inside of the eye. We have this little BB shaped, the tear duct. And then I'm paying attention to the shape, right? So the inside curvature is a little bit rounder, and then the outside becomes increasingly flatter, like this. And then I draw the eyes at the same time. So I draw the upper eyelid on one side, and I draw it on the opposite side. So here, it's actually the opposite way around. So here it's flatter, on the outside it becomes rounder. By the way, for specific advice on how to draw eyes, how to draw facial features, I have separate videos for that I recorded a long time ago for my college classes. But I think they'll be useful for the general public. I'll leave a link to them below as well. Now, I'm going to start sketching the lower eyelid. The lower eyelid tends to be a little bit more symmetrical in shape, meaning that the curve runs more evenly. So whereas the upper eyelid has different curves side to side on just about everybody, the lower eyelid tends to be a little bit rounder, like this. Here and here. And then I'm looking for other things. So this particular model has very prominent epicanthal folds, right? So these flaps that are partially obscuring his upper eyelid, I can start sketching those in as well, on this side and on this side. We can start placing the irises. So let's draw a little bit more of the eyelids. And so we can see a little bit of the upper eyelid here. And now we can start placing the irises. Again, draw them at the same time. Pay attention to how much of the iris is being covered by the eyelid. That's going to be another important aspect of likeness. On some people, the eyelids cover much more of the iris or less, or you can see a lot more of the white of the eyes. It relates to expression, right? Degrees of focus, right? This model is very focused. Right? The eyes are wide open. Okay. All right. Now that I have the eyes, I can start carving into the face and getting the specific shape. So starting from here, I can start indicating the shape of the brows and getting a little bit more specific. And getting the relative widths. So this particular model has a slightly unusually shaped head in that his cheekbones are actually quite high. Look at the curvature here. I can pay attention to where things on the outside line up with things on the inside. That's why it's so important to get the inside first. So for example, where do the cheekbones line up? So we have the cheekbones here. Where do they line up against the nose? They run through the middle of the nose, and then the cheek begins. We can see distances here. So what is the distance between the corner of the mouth and the cheek here? Going this way. Again, work light. Try to use simple lines at this stage. We want to stay as flexible as possible. We're seeing a little bit more of the distances here. All good drawing relies on a keen awareness, keen sensitivity to angles and to spacing, to proportions. So I'm looking at the distance between the brow and his hairline here, and then where the jawline is. Now, these things are also very highly measurable and easily measured. So what I can do to get the correct proportion here is I can measure the distance from the center line to here, and then compare that to the height. Right? So from the center line to the side of his face is the same as from the chin to right about, not quite the middle of the nose, lower third of the nose. Right? So I can check those distances and get the proportions right. They can also be eyeballed. Having the facial features in first allows you to make closer comparisons. Right? So again, my advice is to not start with the shape of the face, start from inside, and then start working your way out. I think you get more accurate results that way. Okay, now that we have the side of the face, introduce a little bit of the neck. By the way, always a good idea to introduce the neck, the shoulders, a little bit of the costume. Right? Don't draw floating heads. It looks wrong. Looks like the head is decapitated. Now we can start sketching in his hairline. And placing his ears. Ears have a lot of variation to them. Use the facial features to figure out where the ear sits. So for example, his earlobe, where does it line up against the front of the features? Okay, so his earlobe lines up all the way down here. Right? It's quite low. Where does the top of the ear line up? It lines up with the middle of his nose, right about here. Right? When you have the front of the face, it allows you to get the alignments right. So let's drop this down a little bit. Again, we're going to make a few little adjustments here. Now that everything is in place, we can start making slight adjustments to proportions. Let's get his other ear. Again, I'm checking alignments between the front of the face and the side of the face to get those things right. Okay, that is the construction phase. Obviously, it doesn't quite look like the person yet. We're going to get there. But without this initial construction, we're never going to get there. So that's going to be the next step in the process, is to start working the details, rendering, and then introducing wrinkles, details in the facial features to make it look a little bit more like the person. Okay, well, hopefully my construction is in place so that when I start putting in the facial features, it's going to start looking more and more like the reference. So I'm going to start off with the brows, though really I could start anywhere. If you want more information about how to render facial features, how to shade, I have tons of videos on that on my channel. The main thing is to avoid as much as possible being overly linear. So what I'm doing is I'm introducing some lines, but mostly what I'm doing is I'm actually shading. So when it comes to rendering the eye, what I'm doing is looking at blobs of light and shadow as opposed to putting in sharp lines. And that applies to just about everything I draw. So for example, this really sharp line that I used in my construction process, I'm actually going to get rid of. And as opposed to putting down a sharp line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a little bit of shadow here. The nostril. I'm going to shade. So as opposed to putting down a bunch of sharp lines, I'm going to shade as much as possible. There's always, in drawing classes, levels of separation. When you first start drawing, the focus tends to be on line, and then once you've completed the line process, you start on shading. However, when it comes to drawing the portrait, sometimes drawing with shadow is the most effective method. So as opposed to putting down sharp lines, I'm actually reinforcing the forms with value, right? So for the lips, I used a fine line to indicate the shape, but at this point, I'm going to stop, right? I'm not putting in lines, I'm putting in values. So let's put in this furrow. I think that's going to help a lot in the likeness. This actor has a very focused, sharp expression, and we need that furrow there to access his psychology, his intensity. And then for the eyes, once again, the less lines I can introduce, the better. So I'm still using my 2B Wolf's Carbon pencil. The entire drawing can be done with it. It is dark enough. It doesn't go quite as dark as, let's say, a charcoal pencil. It's almost kind of in between charcoal and graphite in its values. By the way, if you want a comparison and a review of, I think, 5 different kinds of black pencils, including graphite, carbon, black chalk, pastel, I'll leave a video for you. Okay, now we're going to shade a little bit underneath the lower eyelid. There's a little shadow there. And I can start introducing some of the details, the folds underneath his eyes. This photograph has a somewhat complicated value structure in that there's multiple light sources, a lot of different shadows going all different directions. Okay. Yeah, you can see that I'm starting really light and trying to be as systematic as possible, not throw myself into strong darks right away. So let's get the slight values underneath his lower eyelid. We have these little gentle bags under his eyes that we can start getting. These folds are very important in capturing the expression. Okay, here is the next step. I'm going to erase out all the construction. Let's get rid of it. Now it's only getting in the way of our rendering. And one of the advantages of the system I used is actually the construction is kept to a relative minimum. A lot of methods, I'm thinking of the Loomis method, the Riley method, particularly the Riley method, there are lots and lots and lots of construction lines that are okay if you're using an erasable medium like this. It's easy to erase. But if you're using media that is not quite erasable, even maybe like a waxier pencil, right? The construction overwhelms the drawing. It's very difficult to erase, right? I would recommend practicing whatever your method, keeping the construction to a bare minimum, right? Just only to where it's actually needed. Okay, now I'm going to soften this entire drawing with a paper towel. The carbon pencil is a slightly sticky material. It's going to soften, it's not going to erase away. Right? Do not use a chamois cloth for this purpose. That will create a lot of smudging. Right? You can see the values are retained. I have a gray tone now. I've softened things, and now I can use my erasers as well as my dark pencils to start getting all kinds of nuance and gradation. So let's go back in and start getting some additional detail in the darks. So I think one thing that is a key to this particular likeness is the sharpness of the shadows around the eyes. This particular fold is really important. Right? The upper eyelid, the way it goes down, and there's some wrinkles here, right? That contributes to the intensity of the expression. The darkness of the shadows here. Portraiture always involves a little bit of exaggeration, a little bit of caricaturing. So if you see somebody having very prominent features, these are things that actually can be emphasized for the sake of the likeness. So the flared nostrils, I'm really going to focus on making those areas dark because that's, again, part of the likeness. Okay, there's a strong shadow underneath the nose. I'm going to make sure that's there. Let's work on the other eye. There are areas on the face where we have a lot of sharpness, but I want to be as selective about those areas as possible. I'm not going to make everything sharp. That's going to make the areas that are sharp stand out and have that much more emphasis. So I'll always play off areas of sharpness with areas of softness. A drawing that's entirely soft is a drawing without energy. A drawing that's entirely sharp is going to be a drawing that's really graphic and flat looking. You want both. The sharpness gives the softness impact and vice versa. Okay, there's a strong shadow underneath his nose. And let's reinforce his mouth. So when it comes to the mouth, I'm paying attention to where the corners of the mouth are higher or lower than the middle. His mouth is tensed downwards slightly, not quite in a frown, right? It's pulled up towards the corners. But that's part of what gives this face a very intense, aware expression. Let's draw a little bit of his shoulders, the jacket. You want to leave floating heads. Okay, we have a really strong dark shadow underneath his chin here. When working from photo references, these kind of dark shadows can be really problematic because if you draw them exactly as you see them, they might have a tendency to fall through, and as opposed to looking like shadows, look like holes. So here is my advice. Pay attention to where things really need to go dark. For example, in the eyes, the hair. Don't make shadows on skin super duper dark as the hair. Right? If I make the shadow here as dark as this, it's going to look like a hole. It's going to look like the same value as the iris. Be very selective where you place your strongest darks. Right? Only place strong darks where they're absolutely needed. It's a very, very common fault. People want to be dramatic. They want to get a full range of contrast in their drawing. And then they start introducing really strong darks everywhere. Be selective. Don't introduce strong darks everywhere. It's going to have a flattening effect on your drawing. But even worse than having a flattening effect, it's going to create areas where the form actually falls through. It ends up looking really, really broken. Introduce a few gentle wrinkles on his forehead. And the main advantage of this technique, one of the main advantages, is that I can work in both directions. So I can also erase. So I've got some eraser holders here. This is a smaller one. Actually, I don't think I showed you this one. This is a larger one. I end up using both, particularly for little tiny details. This little tiny eraser holder works exceptionally well. We can pick out a little bit of light sitting on the lower eyelid. For example, we can erase out the little highlight on the inside of the eye. It's really great for picking up wrinkles. But the broader eraser works really well also. So again, really complicated series of lights and darks all over his face. The eraser can be used to create textures. So if you don't have any eraser holders, I recommend you get some. They're really useful. Okay, let's put in the value of the hair. Anytime you have something with a darker value, a good first step is just to knock it down to the average value that you're seeing. Then you can get out your blending stump. Soften the strokes. Soften the edges between the darker value of the hair and the skin tone, because that's really important. That transition needs to be soft. And now we can start thinking about the shape of the hair, the fact that it's darker towards the back, darker towards the sides. We've got some reflections here, which we'll get later, but I'm just trying to model the hair. I think he's got a little bit more hair up here, right? What do you think? I think so. I think he needs a little bit more forehead here. So I can use my kneaded eraser to make that correction. And use a paper towel to soften the correction. Okay, we'll leave the hair texture towards the end of the drawing. Let's keep focusing on the facial features. We're going to sharpen up our 4B pencil. Let's see, this is a 2B. Where is my 4B? Here's my 4B. Let's get it nice and sharp and get some of the stronger darks that we're seeing in the drawing. That's going to be the next step. Okay, so I've got my sharpened 4B pencil ready to go. I'm going to use it to introduce stronger darks in my drawing. Again, be careful not to go overly dark. To over darken the shadows, they're going to start looking like holes. I can use it to introduce some textures in the eyebrows. That's something that was missing. But the good thing about this material is that it's still hard enough for fine detail. Right? So if I'm missing some wrinkles, I can put them in. This material is not so soft that I can't introduce really sharp and also very light, subtle details. So let's reinforce the nostril here, the line of the mouth. We can start putting in some of the stronger darks in the iris. And you can see how I avoided, especially here, putting in a really dark shadow. It's going to look really strange, like some kind of tunnel. Always, when you're drawing or painting a portrait, pay attention to where the very darkest values are, and make sure everything else is a little bit lighter. Don't put strong darks in everywhere. Be incredibly selective about where those things are. So one thing I notice is that I'm missing some of the very subtle values here. This part right here looks kind of flat, unfinished, right? Let's do that. However, when you're dealing with things that are very subtle, these very subtle transitions from cheekbone to cheek into the jawline, one thing that can help you do that is the blending stump. Especially once it gets dirty enough, it can be used as a drawing tool. So for example, this little area right here, let's do that with the stump. And if your stump is too clean, then you can get a little bit of material from other areas and use it. So we can use it to model certain areas of the drawing where things are very subtle. Again, this reference is not so easy, right? There's lots of very subtle reflections on his face, multiple light sources. I'm not complaining. I'm the one that chose this reference. The blending stump can be used to model those things. So even this very delicate halftone on his jawline can be done, can be rendered using the blending stump. Just don't blend everywhere. Again, blending stump's really useful, but that contrast between softness and sharpness should be retained. Okay, let's work on his hair, which looks a little bit strange, right? He looks a little bit like a Frankenstein monster right now with this solid square head. Let's work on his hairstyle. When you're dealing with texture, the main consideration is to retain the overall form of the object that you're drawing. So here we have this kind of rounded shape. It's sitting on a round skull, after all. We want to place the texture in such a way that reinforces the volume. Right? Because especially with hair, it's very easy to get the texture to overwhelm the shape you're trying to draw. So I'm just going to adjust the form a little bit. His hairline was receding a little bit too much. I'm going to bring that down. Okay. I'm going to make sure that the strongest texture is where it's closest to the viewer. So here we have really strong texture. I'm going to emphasize the texture here. Where the texture starts disappearing towards the edges of the hair, I'm going to soften it. So always when you're applying texture, and this applies to trees, applies to bark, applies to absolutely everything. Texture where things are closer needs to be stronger. Texture on things that are farther away towards the edges of the form, where things are wrapping around, needs to be softer, even if you're not seeing it that way. This is a case where drawing accurately, drawing exactly as you see things, is going to result in a drawing that's weaker. Right, so here towards the sides, I'm going to emphasize the texture. And I know in the photo it stays sharp all the way through. You might want to break up the hair a little bit towards the edges to show the fact that it's not a buzz cut, it's not made of solid metal. Here stronger, towards the sides, softer. No, we're not seeing this. So basically think of your eye as having incredibly shallow depth of field. Right? The focus is here, towards the sides. Your eyes start to blur out. Which is why, even though we have stronger shadows in the ear, I don't render the shadows in the ear with quite the same strength. So this shadow, the line quality there is softer as well. Right? And your blending stump actually comes in very, very handy in establishing that blur. You can use it to adjust. Right? So lines going this way, start going soft. Sorry, I can't always stay on task. He's a little bit jowlier, right? I made him a little bit younger. It's bothering me a little bit, so I'm going to make a little adjustment to his profile. Just a touch. All right, let's get more curls here. He's still very, very solid feeling here. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't introduce some loose hairs at the edges. Right? He's got a slightly wilder hairstyle here. Right? The contours don't have to be perfectly smooth. And I'm not trying to pick out absolutely every hair, even in areas that are close. I'm just looking for the big stuff. I'm trying to suggest texture as opposed to render absolutely every single hair. Right, so just a few strokes here and there, some adjustment of the contour. Here the texture changes a little bit. We can record that. We can put some stronger darks here if we want. Again, always in a portrait, really any drawing, pay attention to the area of focus. Where do you want people to look most? His face. If you introduce very, very strong darks in the hair, it's going to pull attention away from the face, towards the back. So yes, the hair here definitely needs to be darker. Darker than the skin tone, of course. Don't make the texture too strong though. Right? This is why it's always a good idea to, towards the last second, this is where maybe the 6B pencil would come in handy. If I had one. Do I have one? This is, okay, this is still a 4B. Right, at this stage you can start introducing some of the very darkest darks in the drawing, which usually should be like inside the eye. Right, this is where you want people to look most in the drawing. this down a little bit. Again, you can use the blending stump to create textures on the sides. And let's finish up with the eraser. Put in some stronger lights here and there. There's a little bit of light catching here. The bottom of the nose. See if we can capture it. And one thing we forgot to do, we can put in a few little reflections in the hair. Again, this little eraser holder is fantastic for doing all that kind of stuff. Give the hair a little bit more volume and make the texture here a little more convincing. Okay, I think we're going to call this portrait more or less complete. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.